Alright guys, I've got a interesting little game to share with you today, but the key of this, and I'm going to keep it quite short, is that there's a particular endgame pattern that you really need to know from this, okay? So we'll go through the game. So I played it today. It's actually a 5-minute blitz. We're both rated at 13, 20, 13, 30. Okay, so we've got the Vienna game, bishop comes out, wayward queen, second bishop, so adding an attacker to there, queen comes out to defend the f7 pawn. Now I develop my knight because this also comes with a threat of check here, forcing king d1. So I develop my knight to block that. Black develops his other knight. Now my knight comes in, attacking both the queen and c7. So there's only one, well, there's a couple of options. The queen could have come here as well. Obviously the knight's blocking the return to d8. So in this case, black exchanges knights. I recapture with the bishop and retreat my bishop. Takes. This is kind of okay for me because it's opening up the g file. Pawn pushes to release the light squared bishop, but it hasn't got an awful lot of scope really. A5 is pushed. I'm not concerned about this because I figure that my bishop has options. If pawn pushes there, I can simply go up to here, attack the rook and stuff like that, so I'm not too concerned with that. So now, classic pattern, everyone should know this. When you've got a major piece, so a rook or a queen, pinning the pawn in front of the king, dropping the bishop in there, wins the rook. Okay. And pawn pushes, just drop the bishop back in this case. Okay, and now we exchange a couple of pawns. I attack the dark square bishop, and now I attack the rook. Rook moves. Still pushing up more now, because I'm up the exchange at this point. So trading off material is good for me, but also it's nice to keep, I've got this nice wall of pawns, so push them up, gain the space. Putting my bishop in there just prevents this pawn from advancing. Obviously this pawn will get taken if it advances. I'm just kind of clamping down on my opponent a little bit. Got to be aware of this a pawn here. So I push my rook to block the pawn's progress. Bishop attacks my rook, and I can block that with a pawn. Other bishop comes in. This bishop's actually guarding this space, because otherwise I could have dropped my rook in there and then won this pawn by force. So I push h4 now, h5, and now I figure I can, my rook can actually come around this way as well. Just keeping on the light squares could be all right. King approaches, in comes the rook, and now the bishop dives in. So we've got this deadlock situation. Pawn's defending the bishop's defending the pawn, and now I can't capture without losing material. Okay, but I'm still up an exchange, so the pawns carry on their merry march up the board. And again, so this is a fork on pawn and rook. Pretty much forces the pawn to take. Now rook takes, and now because his king and his rook are on the same rank, I can force the exchange of rooks if I want, and that's going to be good for me because I will then have the only rook on the board for the ending. So we have a pawn push, which doesn't have much merit, and now I decide to trade off his rook. And now, so obviously my other rook is at present indisposed and actually imprisoned in the corner of the board. So now we have a trade of light squared bishops. King moves across, and now I'm maneuvering my king around here. Okay, king's attacking this pawn, so I move back, and now I decide that with my so actually we've got the same number of pawns on the board, right? We've currently got 6 each, but if I take and sack my rook, because my rook's going nowhere. This is an immovable object here, the pawn and the bishop together. there's nothing, I can't capture with my king, and my rook can't go anywhere, so I may as well swap it off. And at least then I'm in a situation where now I've got 6 pawns to my opponent's 5. So what, what can black do here? If the king goes in there, there's a lot of squares covered where it can't move, right? And then, he doesn't want to end up in a situation where he's forced to push that and let me capture and run away. So king tries to come round to b4, and now I get the opposition. So opposition, where your kings are 2 squares apart in line, and what this means is that black's king, now it's his turn, cannot proceed. So he moves away. I now push a pawn because I figured that if pawn takes, and then I'm, this is my pawn advantage basically. I've got a basically a 2-on-1 here. Should these pawns swap off. Black does exchange the pawns because otherwise we've got takes, and then I've got just too much material, really. So we swap off pawns. Now I think this is a mistake on black's part. Okay, because it allows me to play this. I think probably king back here would have been preferable. Okay, and then we swap off. Now I blunder. Okay, this is Endgame 101 stuff, right? You've got a king that is trying to shepherd a pawn to promotion, right? So the move that you should play in this instance, let's say, well, king goes to here, right? Now, what I should do is play king c6 now, okay? Opposition. It means that this king cannot approach, cannot get near, okay? So the move order is king there, and then the pawn can run straight to the line, okay? Now, I'm rushing. I've got 2.5 minutes left on the clock. He's got 50 seconds, and I make a stupid error and push the pawn instead. Right? You don't push the pawn, you push the king, and then, so you advance the king, and then the pawn can come through protected by the king. Because now my king can't advance, right? Now I can't go to c6 to protect that pawn. So change of plan. I'm going to have to abandon this pawn, and I'm going to have to go after these guys. Right? So we go after here, okay, and I'm in a good position now. So now the h pawn, you can see the difference, right? There is no way. How's this king going to stop it? So pawn goes there, king goes there, pawn goes there, king goes there because he can't come on these squares, right? Pawn goes there, king there, and we get promotion. Okay, that's the difference. Okay, so here we have a situation. Right, this is the key thing. This is what we want you to know. The lesson here: you've got a king and a queen against a king and a pawn. Right, the pawn is relatively unopposed. Now, there's a model here. So I throw in a couple of checks, and then I remember this lesson. So here's what you do. And this applies whether the pawn is like on the 3rd rank or on the 2nd rank as well. You literally, you can stop this pawn, right? Now the thing is, if you think about it, this king can happily dance all the way around this pawn, right, all day long, okay, and I can keep giving checks and whatever, but we might end up with a draw by repetition that way, okay. So what you have to do is you have to wait until the king goes behind the pawn. So when the king's in the shadow of the pawn, you can then advance your king. I have to get my king up to this pawn next to it, right, in order to be able to capture with the queen. If I capture with the queen, king captures, we've got 2 kings on the board, it's a draw. I don't want a draw, I want to win. Okay, so king goes here, check, right? King goes back. When the king goes back, right, this is an error on my part. When the king goes behind the pawn, you take 1 step forward. Right, it's like the weeping angels on Doctor Who. If you blink, they move. Okay. So I throw in a check here, and then I remember what I'm meant to be doing. Okay, so king goes behind the pawn, right? King goes behind the pawn, my king moves. King goes there, check. King goes behind the pawn, my king moves. Right, king goes there, check. You see it? See how it works? King goes behind the pawn, king to there, king go, and now the pawn is mine, and so is the game. Okay, so we finish off with that. Okay, now the exact same thing happens. Let's. I'm just going to pull up an analysis board. Okay, setup, empty, and let's do the same thing, right? With like a pawn here and a king here. Okay, and I've got a king miles away, and I've got a queen. Okay, and it's white to move. So let's figure this out. Okay, in fact, let's do this against Stockfish. Finish against the computer, white to move. Okay, and it's got white winning, which is nice to know. Okay, and now this pawn is now only one step away from promotion. But here's the thing, okay? Check him. Okay, and king moves away. Okay, check him again. King moves to there, right? Now the king cannot move away from the pawn because otherwise I'll grab the pawn, okay? So the king has to go behind. When the king goes behind, what do? Advance our king, right? And now I need a check, so that will do. Okay, and let's check again. And you see I'm attacking the pawn. Check again. And check again. And the king has to come here and check again. Now the king has to go behind the pawn again, because otherwise I take it and win. Now my king advances. You see the pattern? Okay. So you need to throw in a few checks until you can force King E back behind the pawn. Now he's going to go away. Now I come here again. This key square right behind the pawn, yeah? Now he has to go there again. King advances. So you need to remember this, because this is a situation you will end up with this a lot when you've got an endgame. Say you've got two kings, two pawns, and it's a foot race to the line, and you get your queen first. You have to be able to remember this. Okay, and another check. Okay, and now we go behind the pawn, and he has to come here again. Okay, well, in this case, we actually win the pawn, right? If he'd have gone there, again, check, he goes behind the pawn, and so on. So, one to remember, and drill this as well, and you can do it. You can do exactly what I just did, right? You go to the analysis board, you set up this position, you say finish against the computer. You can whack Stockfish up to maximum level if you want, because you should be able to win this situation every single time, but you've got to practice it. So if you need to, drill it a few times, because honestly, if you get into an endgame like this and you end up with a draw, then that stings. Okay, so there you go. Really wanted to share that with you because it is one of the endgame fundamentals. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe. I'll see you soon.